What we're going to discuss tonight is going to be the case of the Makallel, called in the mysterious case of cursing. But the reason I called it that is because I think it's very mysterious. Because most of what Parshat Emor is about the Chagim, the holidays. And that actually makes a lot of sense in context. Because we just said that we're in the Sefer Vayikra, we're in the book of Leviticus, which is all about Kedusha and holiness. And we went through the holiness of the temple and temple sacrifices. Then we just went through holiness of space, Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, the holiness of the land of Israel. And because Israel is so holy, God tells us if you don't act in certain ways, Israel's going to spit you out. So we shifted from temple holiness to individual, home, person by person holiness. And then we get Kedushat Zman, the holiness of time. And we learn about the specific times, the holidays, certain dates, that are sectioned off as holy. And that makes a lot of sense too. We're going through all the Kedusha, all the holiness, all the sanctifying that we need, so we get to the different holidays. But what doesn't make so much sense, and what is a little bit strange, is that at the end of Emor, at the end of our Parsha, as we go through, after we finish talking about all of the different holidays, we find a strange story. A story that exists in isolation, seemingly unrelated to what came before it, to what comes after it. And the story itself has many, many questions. So we're going to start now in the story of the Makallel, or the Megadev, different rabbinic sources refer to it differently, the story of the one who curses. So we see as follows, in Vayikra Chaf Daled, Leviticus 24, at the end of our Parsha. V'yetzei ben Isha Yisraelit, and a son of an Israelite woman went out, Vehu ben Ish Mitzri, and he was also the son of an Egyptian man, Betoch b'nei Israel, in the midst of Israel. Vayinatzu b'machaneh, and they fought in the camp. Then a Yisraelit, the son of the Israelite woman, Be'isha Yisraeli, and an Israelite, a Jewish man. So just off the bat, is anyone struck by some oddities in this pasuk? Because I think it's a very strange and hard to understand.
I never knew there was intermarriage between Israelim and Mitzrim.
Excellent, yeah. So clearly, one, we see that there's some amount of intermarriage because this man has a Jewish mother and an Egyptian father, so that's very strange. Maybe based off of relying on some rabbinic interpretation, we could say, oh, well, maybe his father was a member of like the Erev Rav. The Egyptians who, towards the end of their time in Egypt, saw that the tides were turning towards the Jews, and they switched sides and became pro-Jewish and converted. Maybe some of the rabbinic sources learned that, because like you said, Jeff, we don't really have really well-documented sources in the Torah about intermarriage between Egyptians and Jews. And that makes a lot of sense also just societally, because Jews were slaves. It'd be very strange for someone who's the ruling class to marry a slave while they're enslaved. So it seems like we have some sort of strange question. How is this intermarriage? What is the circumstances that led to this person? As soon as we see the son of an Egyptian man, we should be asking that question, what's going on here? Great.
Well, there's an Erev Rav, we know that.
Exactly. The only thing we know of is the Erev Rav, but they're pretty well defined and identified as the Erev Rav. So maybe this is the Erev Rav and it's just, it's not identified. It's not important to the story, but it's a little bit strange. For sure.
Or it could be very important to this story because it wants to highlight what comes from such a marriage.
Ah, beautiful. So that is, in fact, one interpretation that the rabbis say. The rabbis, Chazal, one of the classic interpretations, is that it says that he's the son of an Egyptian man to emphasize specifically that he's a descendant of the Erev Rav. He's a descendant of these half-hearted converts who are sort of just following the popular tides. They saw the Jews were doing well, so they converted. And that means he wasn't ever really religiously committed to Judaism in the first place. And that that explains how it could be he can come to commit as big of a sin, as we'll see, as cursing. All right, I think that's a beautiful interpretation. I think it makes a lot of sense. What were you going to say, Richard?
So I have skin in this game.
Okay.
As you can well guess. But you know my last name. But beyond that, there is the closest thing we have to understanding slavery of the Jews was the slavery of the blacks in America. And the slavery of the blacks in America, there was considerable relationships between master and slaves, sexual relationships in which there were offspring, and the notion of marriage, of course, is imposing another idea upon it, But the fact that I don't think anywhere here in the pasuk it says they were married.
Very
I
good
think
point.
they said they had a relationship and had a child.
Very, very good point.
This is common, I would have to say, among many slave populations, mainly because of proximity. And also, we all know that when there's an unequal relationship between males and females, it is unlikely for that to remain, pardon the expression, platonic.
Excellent point. And I think from a narrative perspective, the point Richard's making also adds a lot to the story. That from the fact that there's a Jewish mother and an Egyptian father, so we could take Richard A's approach, that's telling us that it's Erev Rav, or we could take Richard McBee's, get it? So we could take Richard McBee's approach and say that it's not telling us that, oh, the father wasn't the father is an Egyptian. It could be giving us character background, that this is the child, maybe of an unfortunately non-consensual or rape or some tragic circumstance, that his enslaved mother had a child, was forced to have this child with an Egyptian man.
Yes.
Sorry, and then I'll pass it to Joel, but just as perhaps a support for that is the way that Pasuk presents it. It doesn't say a son of a Jewish woman and an Egyptian man. It says the son of a Jewish woman who was fathered by an Egyptian man. There's a clear break in the Pasuk. Ben Isha Yisraelit, the son of a Jewish woman, V'hu ben Ish Mitzri, and he was also the son of an Egyptian man. So there's a clear break, two separate clauses in the presentation, that they're not one unit. It's not father and mother, husband and wife, but there's these two separate influences or two separate sources of his parentage. Yeah, Joel, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to compare, American blacks, 70%, some studies show, have quote unquote white blood. And then if you look at Eastern European Jewry, there was a lot of, when they had pogroms, Jewish women were raped quite often.
For sure. So I actually think that this background also, this idea of thinking about this from a narrative perspective, this character is born out of pain, born out of slavery, born out of being taken advantage of, is an essential narrative idea, a narrative structure of thinking about the story that follows. And one, I think it's important because then we understand the story that follows. But two, this is a great opportunity to point out one of the things that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, one of my teachers, would always point out about Tanakh. The Meforshim, the commentaries, all had different methodologies about Tanakh. And many of them, especially the rabbis, were very focused on structural things. Where does this appear in the story? What words are used, etc. Whereas other commentaries, for example, Rav Aaron's favorite commentary in the Torah, Ramban, Nachmanides, were very focused on narrative context. Who is this character? What do I know about their background? And what are they feeling and thinking at the time? So whereas our first approach might have been a little bit more structural, oh, it's a Mitzri, let's think in context, what's the Mitzri significance? Oh, he's going to sin, maybe it's a member of Erev Rav. And that's one tradition that, unsurprisingly, Chazal take. From a very narrative, insular perspective, from the perspective that this is a character we're just meeting in a story, what's the thought process? What's the feelings? What's in his heart? Thinking about this from the perspective of, oh, the Torah is giving us his background, that this is a child who was born out of a slavery relationship, out of some form of oppression. That gives us a different narrative perspective on the story. So I think that's an excellent point. So now we have
depends on chronology also. If this is taking place later, Midbar, then this could have happened after Yetzias Mitzrayim. Or excellent. Maybe it took place before Yetzias. We don't know that.
Exactly. So Jeff is touching on another point that the Meforshim, the classical interpreters, bring up. And that's that there's a little bit of an ambiguity when this happens. Because before this, the Torah was not in a narrative section. It was listing the laws of the holidays. So that doesn't place us chronologically. And then this story is actually very similar, very parallel to a story that we find later on in Sefer Bamidbar, which is going to be on the source sheet somewhere, unless I messed it up. No, I didn't mess it up. In Bamidbar 15, we get the story of the Mekotzeis Eitzim, of the man who collects wood on Shabbos. And we'll see it inside, we'll compare them, but they're very, very similar. So some of the Meforshim, some of the commentaries say it must have been they took place around the same time because they're presented so similarly. So that's a great point that based off of where we place this in the narrative, how much we think the Torah is presenting things in order, how much it's thematically presenting things, etc., that will also influence who we think the Mitzri is. So just one more oddity, I guess two more oddities I have in this pasuk. One, I want to point out that very strange Vayetze that he goes out. Where does he go out? Like what's that? What's the word Vayetze even imply here? He goes out from his home, from his tent. Vayetze, and then it gives us his name or his identifier, B'toch B'nai Yisrael. He goes out amidst the Jewish people. Isn't that not going out? Like, I mean, it's his Jewish nation too. Why is it being termed? Why is the verb here vayetze? So I think that's sort of strange. And then we have
isn't that what the guy who cut wood on Shabbos did?
So by the Mikoshesh, we have vayimseu ish Mikoshesh. They found him. It doesn't say vayetze there. Funnily enough, we'll see. I actually didn't include this in the source, but the one other place where we see
that Yaakov went
Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva.
So Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva, Yaakov flees or runs out, right? So there's some sort of fleeing there. So that's a very strong source. What'd you say, Joel?
Vayetze Dina. It's very pejorative.
Dina.
Excellent. Vayetze Dina. And one more source, by the way, where we see this is Vayetze Goliath. Goliath goes out to meet David. So it's never in a really good context that we see a Vayetze. That's already alerting us that something's going on here. Excellent. Then there's a couple other strange things. It's Vayinatsu ben Machaneh just means, and you look in the translation, a fight broke out. Literally means, and they were fighting. But we don't know who. So that's sort of strange. It's not, and he fought, or he caused the fight. There's this figure who goes out into the field, and a fight breaks out. Very interesting. And then finally, I mean, we all picked up on this, but the contrast between the Ish Yisraeli and the Ben Yisraelit is very strong. Isn't a Ben Yisraelit also an Ish Yisraeli? He's the son of a Jewish woman. That's a Jewish man. So it's very interesting that we have that stark contrast. There's the Ben Yisraelit, and then there's the Ish Yisraeli. So all that is to say that what we see so far is that a person who's being identified by their lineage, Jewish mother, Egyptian father, goes out into the camp, whatever going out means. Then a fight breaks out. Presumably it has something to do with him, or else it wouldn't be in the same pasuk. And then we see Ben Yisraeli, Isha Yisraeli. The fight was actually between these two figures. Great. Vayikov ben Ha'isha Yisraelit, the son of the Jewish woman. In other words, our antagonist, our first character is Yikov. Very unclear what Vayikov means. So you'll see, Sefaria translates Vayikov as pronounced. He pronounced the name. All right? That's based off the continuation of the pasuk. It says Vayikalel, and he cursed. So they take Vayikov based in the shoresh of Akav, which means to curse. And they say it means to curse, to curse. Or, okay, we'll see. It's a little unclear, the Shashim. But either way, what we see is there's an ambiguity on how to understand the word Vayikov. And that ambiguity actually affects how you understand the content of the story. So if you look in the Ibn Ezra just brings the two major positions here. So getting 2 out for 1 with this source. The Ibn Ezra says as follows. Yesh omrim shepereshu vayifrosh kamo asher pi Hashem yikavenu. Some people say it means to enunciate the divine name, i.e. blasphemy. Asher nikvo b'shemot, and then it brings a pasuk that uses it in that way. And there's those who say it means like ma'akov, which means to curse. How shall I curse? And that's a totally different conception. So either it means the person blasphemed God by pronouncing the divine name, something you're not supposed to do in a mundane context, or it means something that we see was a thing at the time, that this person cursed his fellow by invoking God's name. So is the cursing, is the Vayikov oriented towards God? He's blaspheming God, or is it oriented towards his fellow, and God's name is just the means for how he cursed his fellow? Also ambiguous. Is he cursing God? Is he cursing his fellow? Now I'll say, in context, which seems to make more sense? Open this to the floor. What'd you say?
His fellow.
His fellow, because he's in a fight. Who gets into a fight and then curses God, right? So it's very strange. So that's one of the major approaches here. Why would it be that he curses God because he got into a fight with his friend over something? Also strange, the Torah doesn't tell us what he got into a fight over. Generally speaking, I think when the Torah leaves out something, we mentioned this by Nadav and Abihu, we'll mention this many more times. I think when the Torah leaves something out, it's because the Torah doesn't think it's important to understand the story. The point isn't what the fight was over, it's just that it happened. But still, we're a very strange situation that this person is in such an intense fight. They're pushed to blaspheme or curse their friend, and we don't know what. Okay, so that's what
cursing your friend wouldn't bring the punishment that's to follow.
So that's a good point, but it might if the way he cursed his friend was by invoking God's name.
The blasphemy in the curse. Yes.
Exactly. Because I think actually the original origin of like cursing as we think of it now was almost always related to something religious or divine. Yeah. So then it might make, it sort of conflates the two a little, but there's still a distinction of orienting it towards God versus orienting it towards your fellow. But excellent point.
So, Rabbi, to follow up on what you just said, though, if indeed the fact that we don't know what the fight was about, and you're saying this is a klal, that if the Torah leaves it out, it means if the Torah is quote making a statement, it's not important. So that would then one would draw the conclusion that, as it were, no extenuating circumstances. In other words, we're given a scenario, something happens, and then there's a consequence we're about to learn, meaning don't think that because X, Y, and Z happen, it could be excused, it could be mitigated. No, we're not interested in the circumstances, in the extenuating circumstances.
Excellent. I think that's a great point too. It either universalizes or at least minimizes the context that's relevant. Right. I think that's a great methodological point as well. Very good. So what we see now is we have some sort of stam case of cursing, some stam case of fighting, whatever that might be, isn't even important to the case. And that results in vayikalel, and he curses. Now the response to his curse, I think, is bizarre. Because we see, vayaviu otoa Moshe. They bring him to Moshe. Why didn't they know what to do? I forgot to include this source, but I know Jeff always has a Tanakh handy. You can check me. Shemot Chafbed, I believe, tells us that anyone who curses God gets Misa, gets the death penalty. Someone who curses God, if you invoke God's name, obviously you get the death penalty. That's already a taught halacha. Elsewhere, the Torah teaches us that if you curse your fellow, you get punished. We already know this halacha. We know the famous examples of bringing a case to Moshe. For example, the Mikoshesh Eitzim, that was a famous example of bringing a case to Moshe because they hadn't yet learned the halachot relating to collecting wood on Shabbos. They didn't know what to do. But we're now in Sefer Vayikra. We've already gotten the Torah. We've already been commanded in Mishpatim against cursing. Why is it that they don't know what to do? What necessitates bringing this man to Moshe? So that's something hopefully we'll be able to answer a little bit tonight. Why is it that the Jewish people are so confused by this case? Great. And now, fascinatingly, the Torah all of a sudden chimes in, and it gives us a little bit of identity. It's not just an anonymous son of a Jewish woman, but rather, Shem Imo Shlomit Bat Divri L'Matei Dan. Here, where the Torah tells us his mother's name is Shlomit Bat Divri. And now, I think this is a beautiful example how, on the one hand, many details in the Torah might just be stated because that's historically what happened. But on the other hand, there's very often significance given to names. Could be God made sure that person had that name because God knows that would be relevant. Could be that the actual name isn't important and God wrote a certain name into the Torah that matters. But what we see is the name here is so ironic because her name is Shlomit, peace. We just saw there was a fight amongst brethren. And she is the daughter of Divri, speech. And this guy just violated the Isser of cursing God with his speech. So we have a very apt name here, an ironic name. Peace, the daughter of speech, is the mother of the curser. Okay, so the Torah comes in here and tells us that it's Shlomit Bat Divri. Excellent. So at this point, we now know very little, but we know that something occurred that required this person to go and be brought to Moshe for their punishment. V'anichu b'mishmar, they put him in jail, as is generally the way they do it when they're asking Moshe for advice.
That's new also. We don't know about Jewish jails.
Excellent point. Yeah. Especially now that we're considering this as coming before the case of the Mikoshesh. We didn't know about a Mishmar until right now. So this innovates an idea that they have some sort of holding cell that they put people in while they wait for God to give them a psak. Very interesting. So they put him in jail. Well, I don't know why they thought it was necessary to put him in jail. Maybe they were afraid he would do it again, I guess. So they put him in jail. Something to think about, actually. Why is it that they feel the need to put him in jail? Why can't they just let him be until they figure out the punishment? All right. God responds. Take him out of the camp. Everybody who heard God's name should put their hands on his head. And everyone should stone him. So it happens to be that this source, this idea that everyone has to lean their hands on his head, is one of the sources invoked for an idea in halacha that if someone hears God's name being blasphemed, then they must mourn appropriately to it. So there's a halacha, for example, if you witness blasphemy, if you hear blasphemy, you have to tear kriya, because everybody who hears God's name being blasphemed is affected by it. Now, that only makes sense if we assume that this is blaspheming God and not cursing your friend. So that's one point to make. But also, I'm not sure that's really so Parshat here that that's what's going on. Leaning their hands on this guy, how does that repair or make up for the blasphemy they heard? Maybe I guess he's almost like a sacrifice, and it's almost like smicha. But that's also like very close to human sacrifice. It's like a little uncomfortable, but maybe that's the idea. It's like a symbolic sacrifice with a symbolic smicha. But I'll point out that when we look at
what they've heard, to expiate what they've heard, they are bimkom themselves. They are they're doing smicha to this, as it were, like an animal.
Exactly. Like a symbolic smicha that they heard violation of God's name that affects them negatively, and to get to do tshuva for that, they have to somehow take it out of their system and put it onto this guy who's going to be punished on all of their behalf. So I do think that that's one possible explanation. I also think that something unique about this case must be the situation that causes this, because when we look at the case in Mikoshesh, in source 3 in Bamidbar, when we see the punishment given to the Mikoshesh, we just see Ragomato Bavanim, stone him. There's no need to do smicha, there's no need for people to lean on him. So clearly there's a difference that violating Shabbos doesn't require this, whereas the case of the Mekalel does require this. So one possible explanation, and Jeff just put it really well, the explanation that many of the rabbis put, is that this is an expression of how you need to do tshuva for hearing blasphemy. And therefore you do it through punishing the guy. So I think that's one explanation. Perhaps if we have time, we'll have time, I'm going to suggest my own, which is a little bit different, but we'll get there.
So can I just...
Please.
First of all, you're leading up to something, or you're kind of moving around something that's very revealing.
Go on.
Smicha, and then also the communal execution.
Excellent.
Seems to imply that there is guilt, definitely not just on that person, that there is communal guilt. And it is as if that we allowed this to happen in our midst, meaning we didn't inculcate everyone with reverence and the kind of thing that you'd never think of doing this, and therefore we somehow are guilty and have to expiate that. So that's like really an amazing concept.
Excellent. I 100% agree. Like Jeff said, like Richard's saying now, what's clear from this is that the guilt lies beyond just the individual. Mm-hmm. Richard's idea as to why is that we as a society failed, that we didn't educate properly to avoid cursing. I think that's one approach, and perhaps even an approach that we find throughout Chazal, throughout the rabbis. What I'm dancing around will be eventually my own interpretation, but I think 100% you're right, that what's clear from this is that the chiddush here, the innovation that we're showing, is that the guilt extends beyond just the party that cursed. And that's a fascinating idea that's going to have many important implications.
And we see this again in the Egel Agrufa, we see this again and again, that there is communal responsibility.
Excellent. And part of this ritual even parallels the Egel Arufa in a sense of having the whole community be involved. The community who might be at fault, might be blameworthy.
This is even more severe.
Exactly. Perfect. So now God continues, and he says, El B'nai Yisrael to deber lemor. Now tell the Jewish people the following rule: Ish ki kalel Elohav v'nasach chata'o. If someone curses their God, they have to carry their sin. Very similar to the prohibition in Shemot, though in Shemot it's debated if the prohibition to curse Elohav means God or if it means a judge. So maybe Shemot was about not cursing the judges. Here it's about not cursing God, but fine. It makes a lot of sense. God has to come in and weigh in on this matter for some reason. People don't know that they can't curse God. Seems very obvious to me, but okay, sure. People don't know that they can't curse God. So God comes and teaches them a halacha. You can't curse God. If you do, nasach chata'o, you have to carry your sin, meaning you get a very severe penalty. You get the death penalty. Nokev shem Hashem, one who does curse God, mot yumat, he shall die. Ragom yirgemuvo kol ha'edah, the entire congregation shall stone him. Kager ke'ezrach, whether they're a foreigner or whether they're a convert, or perhaps it's unclear what ger means in the literal sense, but whether they're a foreigner or a citizen, benakvo shem yumat. When they mention God's name, they get killed. So we have an emphasis here that both a Jew and a foreigner or a convert or someone new to the community alike get the same punishment for cursing God. So far, so good. I understand why we need this prohibition. We see our case, Ben Ish Mitzri. He was a Jew, but maybe we have to expand out from there. That also, even people who aren't super Jewish are included in this. A little strange why, but perhaps we'll address that. From there, though, God goes off the rails and starts talking about other stuff. Be'ish ki yakeh kol nefesh adam motimat. Someone who kills a person must die. U'malkeh nefesh behema yishal mena. If you damage an animal, you have to pay nefesh tachat nefesh, equivalent to the damage of the animal. Ish ki tinmum ba'amito. When you damage a person, kasher asa ken yaseh lo, you have to pay commensurate to the damage. Shever tachat shever, ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, shein tachat shein, tooth for a tooth, kasher yitin mum ba'adam, ken yinatin bo. As you damage someone, so too you shall have to pay for it. So this is bizarre. What does this have to do with cursing God? Why is this coming up here? Also, does anyone know the fancy Latin term for this rule? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Lex talionis.
Excellent. Lex talionis. Yeah. Great, Joel. I just like it because it's a fancy term for something that comes up in the Torah. But what we do see is lex talionis, the law of retaliation, or the law of, whatever talionis means. I always think of it in terms of retaliation. But eye for an eye, this idea of equality. This is very much the basic ethos of Dine Mamonos, of Nezikin, of the entire Seder Nezikin. Fair law, fair justice, eye for an eye. If you do X damage, you pay X damage. So God is invoking, basically, the tort law. He tells us you can't curse God, and if you do, you get punished. And then God goes off on a tangent almost about the very basics of tort law, of law between individuals, of civil law, etc. It's really strange. What does this have to do with the case above? Just to emphasize how strange it is, when we look at Bamidbar, in the case of the Mikoshei Tzim, none of that happens. God comes in the Mikoshei Tzim, the man who violated Shabbos, and God says, Motima, he shall die, kill him. They took him out of the camp, and they killed him. We don't have any long soliloquy from God about various unrelated laws, much less laws we already learned. These are all covered in Parshat Mishpatim. Why are we learning them again? So I think the Parsha inherently begs the question, what is going on here? Why is God giving this lengthy explanation, this lengthy addition of laws?
So Rabbi,
yeah, for sure.
For what it's worth, isn't this portion of the Torah called the Holiness Code?
Of course. Go on.
The Holiness Code. So if this is the Holiness Code, and we are in this particular piece of it, which
I noticed you called. I was out today. I noticed you called me, and I just spoke with Herb.
Barry,
you're not muted.
There we go.
I'm good. What's doing with you?
Barry.
Critical progressive act.
Barry,
mute.
You forgot to mute. I'll message. Maybe
okay. Anyway, if as part of the Holiness Code, I would say that what God seems to be telling us here and communicating this to us is that he has skin in the game.
Go on.
You think holiness just has to do with celebrating my holidays. No, I'm going to tell you that anything having to do with, if you're pardon the expression, Tselem Elokim, has got to do with me.
Interesting.
God.
But why does that come up in the case of somebody who curses God?
Because you would think that, okay, you curse God, meaning you're cursing me, meaning God, right? But also then the other things in which my image, Tselem Elokim, is desecrated, i.e. killing another human being, or even killing an animal which I created, or even harming a piece of that my creation, i.e. an eye, a tooth, etc. I have skin in this game. Don't think that I, God, I'm just above it all, and what you guys do down there is not part of me. No, I'm really I'm part of you, and therefore you've got to treat all of my creation with this kind of sanctity as the entire Holiness Code.
Excellent. I think that is a beautiful idea. I'm going to end up saying something slightly different, but I think one, that's a beautiful idea in its own right. that what we see here is almost, this is actually somewhat similar to what we said for our Pshat in Achrei Mot Kedoshim, that part of the transition that we're going through is a transition from overt spirituality in the temple to recognizing that the spirituality of Israel is predicated upon interpersonal morality, good business ethics, etc. That God is weighing in here and saying, I take just as seriously as I take this guy who cursed me, I also take when you hurt each other, when you hurt property, etc. I think that's a very powerful message. I still think it's a little surprising that it would come here in the case of the Makallel. Of all places, like, it seems like this is the best place to give a straightforward answer. Like, everyone's confused. They're like, oh, what's the halacha? And God then takes that as the opportunity to go on a tirade or to make a statement about his role in Tzelem Elokim. I think it's surprising, to say the least. I don't think it's a bad shot. I just think it's a little surprising. So I think that's great. And I definitely agree with you that we're right now towards the peak or that conclusion, the culmination of the holiness code, of the Brit of Kedusha, of the sanctity that's trying to be invoked over and over again in Vayikra. I think that's essential to keep in mind as we try to understand this story. So good job. I totally agree. But so now this takes us to a very strange pasuk. So after God goes over his lex talionis, his basic tort law, interpersonal law, God then says, Mishpat echad yeh lechem, there shall be one judgment, kager ke'ezrachi yeh, whether a foreigner or a citizen, ki ani Hashem Elokechem, for I am Hashem your God. A very strange pasuk. What does that mean, Mishpat echad yeh? So we know the rabbis darshan this out and they learn, from here we can learn halachot of courts and how the courts work across different fields of law. You might have thought tort law doesn't have anything to do with capital punishment. Mishpat echad yeh lechem, the standards for edus are always the same. You always have the same standards for testimony. The standards for this, for that, all kinds of things are similar across law. Mishpat echad yeh lechem. That's very clearly a rabbinic, halachic exegesis. It's taking the pasuk in a vacuum, not at all concerned with the context. So I think it's an open question, hopefully something that we'll try to answer together tonight. What does this mean? There's one standard of judgment, there's one mishpat for everybody. Kager, ke'ezrach, a foreigner, a citizen, ki ani Hashem Elokechem, for I am Hashem your God. So one, what does this mean? And two, why is it being brought here? What does this have to do with our case, our story at all? So hopefully something we'll answer together. So then after God comes in and tells us all this, Moshe tells it all to the Jewish people. They take him out of the camp. They stone him with stones. And they do as Moshe said. So the story resolves. So to review, we're left with a lot of questions here. One, strange opening with a Vayetze. He goes out, then he has a fight about something we don't really know what. And more than that, he's characterized in the strange way as the son of a Jewish woman and an Egyptian man. So the first pasuk, absolutely bizarre. What is going on there? Two, we have an ambiguous cursing. Is it cursing towards God, towards his fellow man? Why would he be cursing God if he's in a fight with his fellow man? That's our second question. Three, what's so confusing here that they need to bring Moshe in? Why can't they just say, we learned in Mishpatim that someone who curses God gets the death penalty, so you get the death penalty. And then finally, or maybe 4A and 4B, or 4 and 5, what is up with God's lengthy response? And what is up with the culmination of it, of the concluding words, Mishpat echad yeh lechem, there's one standard of law. So those are the questions I have. I want to look a little bit at some of the classic explanations, but I want to take the classic explanations in a very specific direction. I don't even think it's me taking the direction. I think the classic interpretations lend themselves, beg to be interpreted as I'm about to interpret them. But I want to emphasize that very often I try to bring in my teachers and my Rebbeim in this year, and I'll quote Dr. Yoni Grossman, I'll quote Rav Aron. What I'm saying tonight, last week or 2 weeks ago, I quoted Rav Rosenzweig. What I'm saying tonight is totally my own innovation, so if you hate it, don't blame anyone but me, and feel free to disagree. But this is how I understand the following psukim. So we started off by mentioning that we have this very strange characterization of Vayetze. He's going out. And we pointed out that there's some sort of negativity associated with Vayetze, with going out. It's never a good thing. You flee somewhere. So of course, Chazal pick up on how strange this is, and they also pick up on the connotation. And Chazal give all different types of explanations for why it uses the term Vayetze. So Rashi brings a bunch of them, but I want to focus on the last one Rashi brings. So Rashi says as follows. Vehechan yatsa. From where did he go out? Masnisa Amra, there's a brisa that says, Mebeis Dino Shel Moshe Yatsa. He went out from Moshe's court. Mechuyav. And he was declared guilty. He was declared chayev. So what was the case? Why did he go out from the court of Moshe? Ba lita ohalo betoch machere Dan. He wanted to pitch his tent in the encampment of Dan. Amrulo matu chalakan. They said, "What right do you have to be here?" Amrulem ibnei Danani. He said, "My mother's from Dan. I'm a Danite." Amrulo. They said to him, "Ish adiglo otot levet avotam." Your shevet, your tribe depends on your father, and as we know, his father is Egyptian. So he took them to a court. And Moshe said, "You're wrong. Nope, you don't get to pitch your tent with Dan because we follow the father's lineage for establishing your tribe." Amad v'kides. He was so outraged he blasphemed God. So already we see one interpretation or one explanation as for why blasphemy would make sense here. The Vayinitzu, the fight, was about where does he get to pitch his tent? Where does he get to live amongst the Jewish people? And when he lost his court case, he was so outraged he blasphemed God. So I think that's a little bit strange, but maybe already we're sort of understanding a little bit better. It wasn't blasphemy just because he got into a fight. It was blasphemy because he was upset at the result of a court case. Okay. But I think what's really
very interesting. This is the beginning of the dispute between patriarchal and matrilineal descent. I mean, it's just like this is blowing my mind. What can I tell you? It's like,
Richard, you're not even saying anything so I don't know, heretical, because we're about to see the Rishonim literally have that machloket here. The Rishonim have a machloket here about pre-Matan Torah was descent patrilineal or matrilineal. Excellent. Wow. So we're about to see, but I think the reason you picked up on that so fast and it's so amazing is because what we see from the story and what Chazal are expressing here is that there's no way to understand the story without understanding the significance of the Ben Isha Yisraelit U'ish Mitzri. He's being made to feel like an outsider. He doesn't have a place in the camp. His father is an Egyptian. Everyone else is organized according to their father. He literally has nowhere to live. And he goes to Moshe. He picks a fight with this guy. He says, "There's no way this guy's right. What, I'm not supposed to have a tribe?" So he goes to Moshe. Surely God, the court system, halacha, are going to side with me. And when God, the court system, and halacha don't, he's outraged. And that leads to Amad v'Gidei. He blasphemes. It's a response to being made to be an outsider. I think that gets even clearer when we look at what his status was in the community beyond the tribe. Whether he was considered Jewish at all, as Richard raised, the question of matrilineal versus patrilineal descent. Because Rashi quotes from the Sifra, from the rabbis, Melamed Shiniskayer. This guy was a ger, because his father was Egyptian, and there was patrilineal descent until Matan Torah. So he was a full-on ger. He wasn't Jewish based off his mother being Jewish. And in fact, if we look at the Chizkuni, fun fact, a methodological fact, Chizkuni, another medieval commentator a little bit after Rashi, but the Chizkuni bases himself on Rashi's commentary. That doesn't mean he always says the same thing as Rashi, but oftentimes he'll say similar things or explain Rashi, because the Chizkuni is based in Rashi as his source text. So the Chizkuni says, Davar Acher, one interpretation here, Betoch B'nai Yisrael, he went amidst the Jewish people, the Fi Pshat, according to the simple understanding, Hayam Ninshach Acher Aviv HaMitzri Mashas Shibud Ad Acher Matan Torah. According to the Pshat, the simple understanding of the Torah we learn from this, Judaism was patrilineal until Matan Torah. So this guy, when he was born from an Egyptian father, was a total non-Jew. V'acher kach niskayer. And afterwards he converted, Ubalo etel mishpachat imo. And he went according to his mother's tribe. He felt he was entitled to belong to his mother's tribe. So we see that the Mefarshim read this not just as a family history, not just as an interesting and important narrative background to the mindset and emotional feelings of this person, but an actual definition of status. This person was not Jewish. And there's going so far as to say patrilineal descent was the reason why he wasn't Jewish. Pre-Matan Torah, Judaism followed patrilineal descent. Crazy idea to find in the Torah. Yeah.
I was thinking before when we first talked about the Vayetze and the construction of the sentence, but it didn't seem right to me to say what I will say now, that maybe he reversed his or tried to reverse his gerus, because he says, you won't have me, I won't have you first.
Oh, very interesting. Beautiful. I think what Richard is saying is a key to understanding the story. Richard's saying, well, now that we understand that he's a convert or he's some sort of foreigner, and he's coming into the community and somewhat being rejected or being told he doesn't have a place, the klala, the cursing, takes on a very different valence. It's not just outrage, it's intentional blasphemy of God, because he's not being accepted into this community, he's going to reject that community. Blaspheming God is not just anger, but it's a formal rejection of Judaism. I think that's such a powerful idea, and I think it's so clearly the way to understand this. And I'm going to bring a proof text for it, but first, I just want to show that this controversial idea surrounding the idea of patrilineal descent was very unpopular with the Rishonim. It's the pshat. It has to be said, but already the Ramban, Nachmanides, hates it. Ramban says, Hatzarfatim umrim, the French say, Kitam hageret v'nei she'kodem matan Torah v'mishpato leilei hakar zachar, that before Matan Torah, religion was patrilineal. Masha amru b'yavamos b'umos halach hakar zachar, like we see in the Gemara that non-Jewish nations are patrilineal. Kasher nolad zeh lo maluoto ki mitzri haya b'dino. And therefore, this guy must have never gone to bris milah because he was an Egyptian. Aval keshegadol niskayer ladato, and then when he got older, he converted v'nimol and had a bris milah. Ve'ein dati kach. There's no way that's true. Ki me'ein sheba Avram bebris hayisrael b'goyim lo yischashvu. Because from the time that Avram got a bris, the Jewish people were considered special and had matrilineal descent. Totally rejects it. What's interesting is the Ramban actually takes the exact opposite significance from this idea of him being a ben ish mitzri. Yeah, Richard, what were you going to say?
Well, okay, doesn't this all bring up the issue? This is not a theoretical issue. In other words, is he really Jewish? Is he not Jewish? If he is not, if in some sense, as a matter of fact, as seems like Moshe Rabbeinu himself, paskins, he's not Jewish, i.e., does not merit to be in the tribe of Dan to live, and we execute non-Jews.
Excellent.
Ooh, now I'm not saying we don't, but that's really crossing a whole other line.
Now because Richard said it, I'm going to give you my pshat. We're going to go through the second again, and that is exactly what I think is going on here. So the Torah tells us that there is a son of an Egyptian man. And what the Torah is setting up is that it's the fact that he's the son of the Egyptian man that leads to the fight. What do they fight about? Doesn't matter. They fought about the fact that he was an Egyptian man, and that led to the fight. Was it about where can he plant his tent? Was it about his tribal identity? Sure. Those are all good expressions of a possible fight over his place in the Jewish society, over his identity. And then, because he was being so excluded by Judaism, because he was being pushed out, in response, he curses. And it's not that he curses his brother, he curses God, because cursing God is an expression of rejecting religion. And now let me give you a cool proof text for this. In Eov, after Eov is faced with all of his struggles in the second chapter, the Satan comes, whatever that means, because it's a weird book, and punishes Eov with all of these things. And after Eov struggles through losing his children, his wife says to him, "Atomer lo ishto," Eov's wife says, "Odcha machzik b'tumatecha? Why are you still holding on to your integrity and to your faith? Barich Elohim v'meit. Curse God and let's see if he kills you. Reject religion. Mm-hmm. Let him try and kill you. If he kills you, fine, you have nothing to live for. And if he doesn't, you know the religion is fake." In other words, blasphemy is the ultimate sign of rejecting a religion. You're blaspheming the God. So what we have here is a person who is being treated so badly by his fellow Jews because of his lineage. He's being made to feel like an outsider. He says, like Richard said, other Richard said, if you don't want me, I don't want you. He rejects God because of the poor interpersonal reaction he just had with his fellow Jews. But
to answer the other Richard, we do kill him for such a reason because the second of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is not to curse God.
So that's a good point. It's a mitzvah ben Noach not to curse God. But I think what's going on here is maybe even a little more subtle, because I think the perspective the Torah is trying to express is, of course, he's a Jew. He should be a Jew. He's a Ben Yisraelit. You guys shouldn't be focusing on the fact that he has a questionable lineage. He's clearly part of you. He's Yetze betoch b'nei Yisrael. He's trying to be amidst the Jewish people. And I think when people are confused and they go to Moshe, this is a criticism of the Jewish people. They say, oh, a non-Jew just blasphemed our God. What are we supposed to do? But he's not a non-Jew. He's a ger, ke'ezrach. He is a convert, a foreigner, like any other citizen. And I think that explains the confusion, the ambiguity. What are we supposed to do? We just had another person from another nation blaspheme our God. For example, in Shmuel, when Goliath blasphemes God, we don't have the court swoop in and say, well, now you're chayav misa. Maybe he was, you're right, a Ben Noach would be chayav for that. But practically, like Richard McPhee raised, it's a different nation, it's a different person. What's our jurisdiction over them? So they say to Moshe, all right, so what do we do? Because they don't know how to apply the laws of Mishpatim, the law in Shemot Chaf Bet about cursing your God, to someone else, a foreigner who curses God. So they say, what should we do with him? So what does God say? God says you should stone him. Why? Anyone who curses God, keger ke'ezrach. It doesn't matter whether they're a foreigner, a convert, or whether they're a fully born Jewish. But God goes one further. And God says, in fact, you should treat him fully like your partner, just like the laws, the civil laws that only apply to other Jews. We know in the Torah, the basis of tort law, lex talionis, the need to repay your fellow, civil law only applies, midoraisa at least, to your fellow Jew. We know, thankfully, the rabbis instituted that it applies on a rabbinic level to others, etc. But what God is saying is that there's no distinction between this guy, whether in religious law, in civil law. Just like you won't kill him, you won't steal from him, you should also treat him like a Jew ritually, religiously. You should take his religion seriously, and you should take his practice seriously. This convert, this foreigner, came and joined the Jewish nation. So we have God go and say, lex talionis, the ethos, the very heart of Jewish law, applies to this guy. And that is ultimately mishpat echad yalechem.
But doesn't it make you a little bit uncomfortable to think that God doesn't cut him a little slack here? I mean, God's way of teaching the Jews how to treat him as an equal, to say, just like you would kill one of you, you go and kill him. I mean, give him a break of this one time.
Well, I think, ironically, giving him a break would make him less of a Jew. That's the
that's fine. But I think maybe he'd rather, give him another chance to show.
A little uncomfortable, a lot uncomfortable.
Give him a little, what do they call it? Anger management therapy instead.
I hear that, but that's definitely legitimate. But I think it's also sort of like almost like a beautiful expression that God's saying he's such a Jew that even when he tries to renounce his Judaism, he's a Jew. If he blasphemes because he's done with the religion, we don't care. Once a Jew, always a Jew. He gets Misa like everybody else. So like it's a true extent, the extent to which he's fully integrated into the Jewish community is that nothing he could do could ever push him out. Yeah, Jeff, what were you about to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's surprising that Moshe didn't say that actually, that he went through Pesach. He ate Korban Pesach. I assume he was part of the Jewish people and he went out.
Not if he was born afterwards, which you suggest.
If he was born afterwards, but let's say he wasn't. But there's no question he's a Jew. We accept him into the Machne. He's part of the Kehillah. So if that's the case, and Moshe knows that, why is he even? Why does he need to go to God to get an eitzah on this? Why does he need the Pesach?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's an excellent point. And I think in a similar vein, actually, very interesting, there's a midrash that says that this Egyptian man who fathered Mekalel was actually the Egyptian man that Moshe killed. And that's a very strange midrash. But one, I think it's sort of pushing in this idea of like Moshe should be sympathetic to this. Why? Because I think the story of Moshe killing the Egyptian man is the moment Moshe identifies with the Jewish people and not the Egyptian people. So maybe on one level what's going on here is that Moshe is still self-conscious about the fact that he also has Egyptian identity to an extent. He was the Ish Mitzri, so he's going to let God tell them and he's not going to tell them himself. He doesn't want to be like, oh, well, yeah, the guy who grew up in Pharaoh's palace is super lenient on the Egyptians, so maybe that's it. But also maybe Moshe himself also struggles with this question of what is Jewish identity? Am I aligned with the Ish Mitzri? Of course, at this point, Moshe is aligned with the Ish Yisraeli. He's aligned with the Jewish people. But we know Moshe's own background. Chazal are reminding us, Moshe's own background is characterized by the question, how does someone who grew up in the Pharaoh's palace transition into being a Jewish leader? So I think that's what this Midrash is getting at, but I think it's a beautiful point. Of all people, Moshe should be the most sensitive to this. So either it's a question, why isn't he? Or maybe it's a character flaw, or maybe it's Moshe himself being overly self-conscious that he isn't taking a stance on this. I think that's what Chazal are mentioning.
You may be leading to a very solid answer, but I think that if you aren't, or at least I'll say it before you do,
sure,
that I'm glad you referenced Sefer Eov, because I think the point of Sefer Eov is to say there are some questions that simply can't be answered. You have every right to ask them, but you won't get an answer that you are very comfortable or happy with. And I think that here, let's say that this guy was allowed to live. Where would he live? He can't be accepted by Machne Dan. Well, he's going to be an outcast wherever he goes.
I hear that. On the one hand, this is a bit of like a model almost of like someone who's like being unfortunately rejected from Judaism for like some silly reason. On the other hand, I think we could figure it out if we had a creative enough court system. If anything, it's tragic that we don't have the answer to where should he live, because that could be a great model for inclusivity to an extent. But no, I think it's a good point that we see here that this person legitimately had a difficult struggle of fitting in. There's no obvious answer as to where they should fit in. But nonetheless, the wrong response is blaming God, is denouncing religion and blasphemy. This person deserves empathy and inclusion, but that doesn't legitimize their undermining of religion.
You must know that there are many, many Jewish people who started out not Jewish, who will always be known by their community as the convert.
For sure. It's something that we still can work better on. I think that's certainly one message here. But I think in a similar vein, I want to tie two messages that I think both Richards have mentioned at this point. But definitely Richard McPhee mentioned before. That I think really ties all this together. One, I think this perspective also explains the communal guilt, or the way this parallels Eglah Rufa, or why everyone's leaning on him, because everybody involved is to blame. There is a broader blame for making him feel like an outsider. So part of the process of tshuva is not just on the blasphemer, but it is on the community. It is on everybody for not recognizing that they caused this. They pushed him out. So fine, he's going to die because he actually did the blasphemy, but everybody else is going to have to do some amount of tshuva as well. Everybody else will have to lean on him, have a personal connection to him before he's killed. Secondly, why is this here? Why is this coming up here? Maybe this is just when it happened in chronology. That's always a possibility. But I think it also really touches upon what Richard was saying. We have here the culmination of the Brit Kedusha of the holiness covenant. And holiness, spiritual sanctity, that applies to the Jews. The Jews are Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. They're the holy people. But like a ger, that's not a real Jew. A convert's not a full Jew. They're not really holy. So after finishing the holiness covenant, the ultimate expression of holiness is accepting a ger, is accepting a convert as much as you can, accepting the convert into your community and recognizing that holiness stems from one's actions and not just from one's birthright. That when you follow the laws of Kedoshim, when you have a moral interpersonal code, when you dedicate yourself to Hashem, you're just as kadosh, just as Jewish as everyone else, irrespective of your parents. And that's ultimately how we cap off the holiness covenant. Oh, what about Bahar B'chukotai? I don't know yet because I haven't prepared next week's Parsha, so we'll see. What we see here, though, is that really this is the capstone to our mission of Kedusha, our mission of holiness in the temple and in our own homes, is making sure that every convert, every foreigner is ke'ezrach. The mishpat echad yelachem, everyone is included and everyone is treated equally under the law. So hopefully the story makes more sense according to that. If you don't like it, as always, feel free.
Very good.
Call, complain, do whatever you want.